Good morning. This is the Lew Rockwell Show, and how great it is to have as our guest this morning, Judge Andrew Napolitano. I should say it's an honor, as well as, of course, great to have him on. Judge Napolitano is, who can compare to him as a spokesman and an expert on legal issues in all of television? Of course, since 1998, he's been Fox News' senior judicial analyst, but he's always the most interesting and most on-target person on all these issues. He's an orator of Ciceronian proportions. When you hear him at the podium, you're reminded of the grand days of Cicero and Hortensius and the other great speakers of ancient Rome. Not only that, but he's a scholar. He's the author of 7 important books on the Constitution, on civil liberties, especially civil liberties in wartime, about human freedom. 2 of them have been New York Times bestsellers. I hope this latest one joins that particular group, and it's called Theodore and Woodrow, How 2 American Presidents Destroyed Constitutional Freedom. So, Judge, why these 2 guys? A lot of bad American presidents. Why these 2 guys?
It's a great question, Lou, and thank you for a very flattering and endearing introduction. I deeply appreciate it. You have played no small role in my ability to publicize and articulate the values of personal liberty in a free society, and as grateful to me as you are, I am equally grateful to you. These 2 presidents, who of course hated each other, ran against each other, and as far as we know, only met once in public, were the beginning of the end for personal freedom in America. It took 100 years for the progressive agenda to start very slowly and actually with a smiling face under the 2 of them, and to come to fruition with the re-election of Barack Obama, and in his hands instruments of government which the Republicans enhanced for George Bush and were handed on to Barack Obama. Stated differently, the welfare state was essentially commenced in the progressive era and enhanced by FDR and LBJ, and eventually even by Republicans who learned that they could get reelected just by giving away cash that the government didn't have. And we now have reached nearly the tipping point where nearly half the country is supported by government largesse, which is either money extracted from the taxpayers or money borrowed in their name. But all of this begins with this progressive movement in the first 20 years of the last century, which under the guise of making the government more responsive to people, under the guise of making it more democratic, lowercase d, in reality runs rampant against the protections of the Constitution.
I remember for example, Trading with the Enemy Act that Woodrow Wilson was responsible for, that potentially gives a president total dictatorial power over the entire economy. That law is still on the books, and there's Federal Reserve, all the so-called independent regulatory agencies.
Oh, sure. Let me tell you the principal value judgment that Wilson and Roosevelt made. They did not believe that the Constitution means what it says. They did not believe that it is the supreme law of the land. They did not believe that it consists of unique, discrete, delegated powers, which, with the exception of Lincoln, all their predecessors did, and with no exception, all the people who wrote the Constitution did. So they believed that the Constitution unleashed the federal government to do whatever it wanted, so long as whatever it wanted wasn't specifically and expressly prohibited in the Constitution. That, of course, is the very opposite of what the founders gave us, which is a central government of limited powers. Unfortunately, the belief that they embraced, and perhaps because it was embraced by both a Republican and a Democrat, and perhaps because of the bizarre juxtaposition of TR serving 2 terms and then picking his successor and then hating his successor, William Howard Taft, and then deciding to run against him and then splitting the vote and Wilson getting in. It was just a bizarre series of events which resulted effectively in this 20-year period presided over either directly or indirectly by the 2 of them, but certainly by their ideology. And the 20-year period manifests the view that the feds can do anything they want. So you're right. As good as it is to have pure food and clean water, it is not good to have pure food and clean water at the point of a gun, which is effectively what the Food and Drug Administration is, because all government is essentially the negation of liberty and essentially coercion. So these 2 guys, again, under the guise of we're going to make you healthier, happier, and freer, in fact, sapped liberty and sapped property from people in order to micromanage society from the federal government. Woodrow Wilson borrowed $50 million to fund World War I. The federal government is still paying the interest on that $50 million. I know it sounds ridiculous. They never paid it back. Oh, they rolled it over, so the people who actually loaned it got paid back, but they got paid back by loans from other people. And the federal government, beginning in this era, with its own printing press in the form of a Federal Reserve and its own spigot of cash in the form of federal income tax, begins borrowing money that it never intends to repay. Federal income tax was sold by Wilson, promising that the top rate would never exceed 3%, and it would only apply to people making more than $10,000 a year, or the rough equivalent of about $250,000 today. Of course, we know that that top rate went up to 91% under FDR and sits somewhere around 36, 37, or 38 today.
Thanks to everybody who shops at Amazon.com. I wanted to mention that LRC gets a small commission at no cost to the buyer every time you go to Amazon through an LRC link, any of the widgets on the page for books or other items, or entering through the ad at the top left-hand corner of the front page. So thanks again, and it's a huge help. And Amazon, what a great company. It's just extraordinary. You don't need to go down to the local bricks and mortar place. You don't have to pay, in many cases anyway, sales taxes. So far as I can tell, virtually everything the human race produces is for sale at Amazon.com. So I highly recommend it. It helps keep LRC alive and growing. So thanks to all of you who shop at Amazon. Judge, as you point out in this wonderful book, these guys didn't exactly hide their authoritarian tendencies in Roosevelt's writings and speeches, in the man H.L. Mencken called the Apostle Woodrow, in the writings when he was president of Princeton. I always like to think of you as a Princeton graduate countering for that university.
You know, the Wilson side of this is a little personal for me, and I did my best to articulate that, and I think it's called an author's note or something I wrote after I wrote the book, but we put it in the very front of the book. Being a Princeton alumnus and having studied history at the undergraduate and the graduate level, I don't have a graduate degree from Princeton, but was permitted to take many courses in the grad school and took a couple courses from Arthur Link, who was Wilson's official biographer, no longer with us. But Professor Link studied under a professor who studied under Woodrow Wilson himself. So Wilson at Princeton is like Kennedy at Harvard. I mean, just adulation after adulation. It is very difficult to study him seriously at Princeton and come to the conclusion that he was a destroyer of human freedom. So I was pretty much an outcast. What else is new? Starting in those days, Lou, on this subject matter. But he truly was an authoritarian, an old, cold, stiff authoritarian. The Espionage Act of 1917, which he used to prosecute Norman Thomas, a Princeton graduate who was a socialist who ran for president against him. He used it to prosecute people for a speech. There was no actual espionage. If Thomas stood on a street corner saying the government should own the means of production. I don't believe that. You don't believe that. Most people listening to us now don't believe that. But we also believe that the government can't criminalize the speech of those who advocate for it. That is still the law today. When the New York Times revealed that George Bush was authorizing torture after he had denied it publicly, his then Attorney General Alberto Gonzales threatened to prosecute the New York Times under the Espionage Act of 1917, which, by the way, was used aggressively during World War II, World War I, once or twice during World War II, and has sat dormant ever since.
No, and of course there were people put in jail for disagreeing with his war policies, too.
Oh, sure. There were people put in jail for performing works by Beethoven in public. There were people put in jail during World War II for reading the Declaration of Independence, particularly the part about when government is destructive of liberty, it is the duty of the people to alter and abolish it. Wilson was terrified of that language. The Palmer raids, A. Mitchell Palmer, notoriously authoritarian, sort of J. Edgar Hoover type attorney general, all occurred under Wilson. These were raids of liberals, of leftists. You know, again, I don't approve of their ideology, but will defend to the death their right to embrace it, extol it, and talk about it. Wilson, of course, would have none of that. Wilson was also, as was FDR, a nativist and a racist. I mean, they hated Italians, Catholics, blacks, Jews, Native Americans. They segregated the federal government by race. They segregated the military by race. For all of the fault of the monsters who ran Reconstruction, by the end of Reconstruction, the federal government was integrated and the federal Army and Navy was integrated. Wilson and FDR and TR ended that. In fact, the FDR kept it segregated. It wasn't until the mass murderer Harry Truman became president that he desegregated the military and the civil service, which TR and Truman had divided by race.
In fact, during under Wilson's reign of terror, when speaking German was, of course, became a, if not an official crime, an unofficial crime, there were even German teachers who were lynched.
That I didn't know.
Yeah.
If I'd known that, that would have been put in there. If it's in there, I don't remember it. But look, the point is this: the government did not hesitate to use horrific tools at its disposal, like hatred for nationalities. Look, World War I was arguably the least useful, least defensible war in our history. It was nothing but a dispute between monarchs, and the monarchies were dying over border lines in Europe. Wilson, of course, manipulated the United States into the war, but by various means, not unlike FDR with World War II, but not as horrific as FDR in terms of the amount of death and destruction necessary to whip the American public into a frenzy. But Wilson is the paradigm example of how the government loves war, about how war is the health of the state. I disagree with almost everything FDR made, but I can understand the argument that Nazism was a profound evil that needed to be eradicated. There was no evil in Europe that needed to be eradicated, and yet 2.5 million American boys fought in a horrific, horrific place, facing the most awful weapons in history in the form of mustard gas, so that Woodrow Wilson could somehow preside over the League of Nations, which, of course, the United States Senate had the good sense never to ratify.
And I think there's no question that Wilson getting us into that war led to that becoming the kind of war that destroyed Europe, destroyed the old monarchies, and led to the creation of Nazism and communism. There probably would not have been a World War II if it hadn't been for Woodrow Wilson.
Couldn't agree with you more. Wilson personally presided over the negotiations for the Treaty of Paris. Normally, at the end of a war, presidents send their best diplomats, who are personal friends with the diplomats on the other side, to negotiate a peace agreement. Wilson himself, the Princeton professor who always dreamed of a one-world order, took a boat to Paris to preside over the Paris Peace Accords. They are so draconian against the Germans that they planted all the seeds for the Weimar Republic and for Nazism. He is literally as personally responsible for World War II as is his ideological descendant, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Well, Judge, it's so great that you're informing people about this because, of course, as you point out, the roots of our current troubles and the current authoritarianism goes right back to these guys and to the progressive era that they helped inaugurate and fasten on us.
It did. It really changed the government radically. I mean, for them to argue that it is better for democracy for people in a state to elect U.S. senators rather than the state government sending the U.S. senators was a very attractive argument. But just like when the government takes tax dollars away from people that they otherwise could use to invest and fails to consider that that money is no longer available for investment, the Wilsonian argument failed to consider the consequences of the popular election of U.S. senators, and that principal consequence was the destruction of the sovereignty of the states. And the sovereignty of the states is not a historical accident. It is something profoundly intended by the Constitution and by the framers so as to be a check on the power of the federal government. But once the sovereignty of the states was eradicated, once the state governments could be told what to do by putting dollars in front of them by the Congress, then that one of the last check and balance, if you will, on the federal government was gone. All of this is created under the Wilson era. I once wrote a piece, I don't remember where it was published, but I used to ask this question when I was teaching constitutional law at Seton Hall Law School in Newark 20 years ago. Is it possible for a part of the Constitution to be unconstitutional? And the students would always say, well, no, how could the Constitution be unconstitutional? It's there. I've argued that the 16th Amendment is unconstitutional. Oh, it was validly ratified. It wasn't like the 13th or 14th or 15th Amendment, which was ratified with a gun, literally, to the heads of legislators in the South. You will ratify this amendment or we will pull the trigger. It was validly ratified, but it so radically assaulted the structure established by the Constitution by changing the way U.S. senators are elected. That so radically destroyed state sovereignty that it is, in my view, one of the several unconstitutional parts of the Constitution. All this was created by Woodrow Wilson. He actually argued for the popular election of senators 30 years before it became the law of the land.
Judge, I'll leave you with a personal note. A favorite paper of ours, The Wanderer, was always Der Wanderer. I mean, it was published in German until Woodrow Wilson made them change that, because any German language publication, like any publication that was questioning Wilson's policies, was barred from being mailed. The post office would bar them. And that's the way all, especially weekly newspapers in those days, they were all distributed by mail.
Wow,
so they were forced to become an English language publication by Woodrow Wilson.
I love The Wanderer, and I knew it was in German, but I did not know the history of why it is now in English. You know, in some respects, Wilson should have thanked the Kaiser for World War I, because the government loves a crisis and the government loves a war, and he got to ruin so many lives and steal so much property and crush so much freedom, all because the Kaiser and some of his European fellow monarchs couldn't agree on a few borderlines. They were able to seduce the Americans into the war. When will the government ever learn? I don't know. You know, the other day I used this line. Somebody said, summarize what Wilson did. Well, Wilson and Roosevelt believed they could right any wrong, regulate any behavior, and tax any event. Sound familiar?
Yeah, sure does.
This is 100 years ago. We're going through it again. And we'll probably go through another useless war again.
Yes. Well, Judge, thank you for being the voice of liberty. Thanks for this wonderful new book that I trust is going to make it to the New York Times as well. It's a very important work of history and also so important for today. So I highly recommend it. Of course, we're going to link to it. We'll link to the archive of your wonderful column, which LRC is privileged to carry. But everybody read Theodore and Woodrow, How Two American Presidents Destroyed Constitutional Freedom. You'll be inspired, you'll be outraged, and you'll have even more of an incentive to fight for liberty.
Thanks very much, Lew. It's always a pleasure to chat with you here or anywhere, my friend.
Thank you, Judge. Well, thanks so much for listening to the Lew Rockwell Show today. Take a look at all the podcasts. There have been hundreds of them. There's a link on the upper right-hand corner of the LRC front page. Thank you.